Okay, Unit 5.2, Part 2. We left off with Napoleon in the Empire period, war and defeat. Napoleon had crowned himself hereditary emperor of France in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and believed that an empire now was necessary for France to maintain and expand its influence throughout Europe. So he's trying to take that domestic success that he had had at home and spread it throughout Europe. So we're picking up with the Grand Empire period, with Napoleon wanting to create this great empire similar to that of the great Roman Empire. Remember, he really thought that the Roman Empire was great and wanting to follow through with those actions. So beginning in 1805, Napoleon engaged in constant warfare. Eventually, through this warfare, Napoleon will achieve the largest empire since Roman times, although, as we know, it will be only temporary. At this time, France is going to extend to the Rhine, including Belgium and Holland, the German coast to the western Baltic, and the Italian coast extending down to Rome. Within it are dependent satellite kingdoms, where Napoleon will put his appointees on the throne of these dependent satellite kingdoms. So they're kingdoms that are within his empire and dependent upon Napoleon, and this is where that nepotism is going to come into play. And some of those dependent satellite kingdoms are the Confederation of the Rhine. His brother Joseph Bonaparte will become king of Spain in 1808, appointed by Napoleon. His youngest brother Jerome will become king of Westphalia. His brother Louis will be king of Holland for 6 years before Napoleon had him removed, and will incorporate Holland into France. In Italy, his sister Caroline will become the queen of Naples, and Lombardy, Venice, and Papal States were ruled by his stepson. He will continue those successes or the permanence that he kept in France after the Revolution and abolish feudalism and reform the social, political, and economic structures of these dependent satellite kingdoms or anything that he incorporates into his empire, and will decide against creating a unified Italy, since it one day might threaten his influence with the difficulty he had in Italy there early on. He'll also include the Duchy of Warsaw, the Illyrian provinces, which will include Trieste and the Dalmatian coast. The independent but allied states will include Austria, Prussia, and Russia then at this time, during the time of the Grand Empire. And all countries of the Grand Empire will see the introduction of some of the main principles of the Revolution. Those permanent features that we talked about that Napoleon would keep in France, he is going to extend into his empire. He will spread the French Revolution's ideas and the Napoleonic laws and the end of serfdom and all of these things that we said were permanent at the time of Napoleon coming into his empire. The notable exception, however, will be that there will be no self-government through elected legislative bodies. So he will terminate that of the French Revolution, that there's representation in the government, and we here are seeing that absolutism or despotism coming back in through Napoleon. Initially, Napoleon will be supported by commercial and professional classes who had supported the Enlightenment, but his repression and exploitation will eventually turn his conquered territories against him. And this is because he conscripts people into the French army, makes them serve in the army. He will raise taxes. Remember, he had been lowering them in France because that had been one of the persistent problems in the French Revolution. So he'll continue to lower those taxes in France, but raise them for these other dependent satellite kingdoms or dependent nations. And he will spread the continental system, which we're going to talk about what that means in just a little bit. Enlightenment reformers are going to believe that Napoleon had betrayed the ideals of the revolution at this point, and had become nationalistic. And so how much of an enlightened despot was Napoleon then? He did keep some of the ideals from the French Revolution, but he's very much turned back into an absolute ruler. And this is where we get the War of the Third Coalition. So we've gone through the War of the First and Second Coalition. Now we're into the Third Coalition, 1805 to 1807. And in 1803, Napoleon will begin preparations to invade Great Britain. Remember, Great Britain and France are the two that will stay at war with each other pretty much through this whole entire period, while others will not completely simultaneously go to war with Napoleon until later. In 1805, Austria is going to sign an alliance with Britain, mainly just to be against Napoleon. The coalition will be complete with the addition of Russia under Tsar Alexander I, who happens to be the grandson of Catherine the Great, and Sweden. And why is because they're wanting to go against Napoleon. This is an alliance that will aid all of them and trying to stop Napoleon's empire, his absolute rule. And also because Napoleon's conquest of Italy had convinced Russia and Austria that Napoleon was now a threat to the balance of power in Europe. Remember, Louis XIV had faced the same problem. All the other powers will come together, no matter their differences, to try to keep that balance of power in Europe, to make sure that not one person or one nation has more power than the others. And this is where we get the Battle of Trafalgar of October 21st, 1805. The French and Spanish fleets are going to be destroyed by the British Navy after Napoleon had started bringing ships into the English Channel. And this is under, again, Lord Horatio Nelson, and this is going to take place off the Spanish coast. This defeat of the Spanish, who had been allied with Napoleon, with the French, this defeat of the Spanish and French fleets by the British fleets is going to establish supremacy of the British Navy for over a century, pretty much up until World War I, until the U.S. Navy will come in the forefront over the British. This point makes it impossible for a French invasion of Britain. It makes it no longer feasible for Napoleon due to this defeat by Horatio Nelson. Although Nelson will be killed in battle, he will become one of the great military heroes in English history. Next, we're going to have the Battle of Austerlitz of December of 1805 in Moravia. Alexander I is going to ultimately have to pull his troops out of this battle, giving Napoleon a victory here. Due to this victory, Austria will have to accept large territorial losses in return for peace. And this is at the point where this third coalition is going to collapse. Due to Alexander having to pull the Russian troops out, the coalition of Austria, Britain, and Russia is going to collapse in 1805. And Napoleon will now be the master of Western and Central Europe. Although the British are still, taking them is still unfeasible at this point. In commemoration of his victory, Napoleon is going to commission the Arc de Triomphe in 1806. He will use the classical style. The arc harkens back to the Roman Empire. Remember his great respect for the Roman Empire when Caesars would build arches to signify important victories. Napoleon will clearly be emphasizing the conquest of an empire by the building of the Arc de Triomphe. Prussia will then be twice defeated by Napoleon in 1806 at the Battle of Jena and the Battle of Austerlitz, and Alexander I of Russia will seek peace with Napoleon after Napoleon will win another victory in the spring of 1807. So this is where the third coalition is just completely done at this point in trying to seek peace with Napoleon. And this peace will be sought through the Treaty of Tilsit in June of 1807. The provisions, and this is going to be, if you want to write here to the side, this treaty in June of 1807 is going to be the height of Napoleon's power by forcing the Third Coalition to kind of resign here. The provisions of this treaty are that Prussia will lose half its population and land ceded to France. Russia will have to accept Napoleon's reorganization of Western and Central Europe. And Russia will also have to agree to accept Napoleon's continental system, which again we're going to talk about in just a little bit what that means in more detail. In many ways, the treaty will represent the height of Napoleon's success. So 1807 should be a date you should note as the height of Napoleon's success. The French and Russian empires will become allies, mainly against Britain at this time. Alexander will accept Napoleon's domination of Western Europe, Alexander I, and France will continue to occupy Berlin and enjoy increased control in Western Germany. And so that's going to move us into our next talk, and how does Napoleon deal with Germany? And remember, we still have the German states are divided into 3 independent little states, not unified. And so how is Napoleon going to reorganize Germany? After soundly defeating the 2 most powerful and influential German states, Austria and Prussia, with the defeat of the Third Coalition, Napoleon is going to consolidate many of the nearly 300 independent political entities within Germany. And this is going to give us the Confederation of the Rhine, which you can see here in the light blue in the middle. So there's France, Switzerland, Italy. Here's the Confederation of the Rhine. And this is what Napoleon is going to consolidate. It will equal 15 German states minus Austria, Prussia, and Saxony. And Napoleon will name himself the protector of the Confederation. And many of those tiny German states that we saw develop during the Protestant Reformation under independent German princes will be abolished. At this time, you can pretty much say that the Holy Roman Empire is done. It's abolished. The emperor had traditionally been the ruler of Austria, so by kind of ousting Austria here, the Holy Roman Empire has fallen apart. And a new kingdom of Westphalia was created out of all Prussian territories west of the Elbe and territories taken from Hanover. This will end serfdom. So we talked about serfdom in Eastern Europe under absolute monarchs. This will end serfdom and give peasants the right to own land and move about freely. So still a little bit of those French revolutionary ideals coming through Napoleon, the spreading of the French Revolution into the reorganization of Germany in 1812. However, he's calling himself a protector. We see Napoleon here being more of a conqueror than a liberator. Napoleon will unwittingly, through these actions of being more of a conqueror than a liberator, awake German nationalism due to France's domination and repression of the German states. And this is going to be a problem for Napoleon. So I said that we would talk about this in more detail, the continental system that had to be accepted by Russia in the Treaty of Tilsit. Napoleon, his continental system is really just waging economic warfare against Britain after he loses at the Battle of Trafalgar, after his fleets are defeated and the Spanish, his allies' fleets are defeated by Horatio. So he says, if I can't beat Britain militarily, I am going to defeat the nation of shopkeepers. I am going to shut down their trade. I am going to starve Britain. If I can't beat them militarily, I will just suffocate them out. And so through shifting alliance, Britain had consistently maintained the balance of power against France. And Napoleon is going to decide he's going to have to do something to prevent Britain from keeping the upper hand. So now he wants to weaken them. He knows he can't beat them militarily. The Navy's too strong, but he wants to weaken them. So he gives us the Berlin Decree of 1806, and Napoleon basically seeks to starve Britain out by closing ports on the continent to British commerce. And so trade is very important to Britain, and he wants to block this trade from Britain to the continent of Europe. Napoleon will coerce Russia, Prussia, neutral Denmark and Portugal, and Spain all to adhere to the boycott and the Treaty of Tilsit of 1807 that we just talked about. And so this is what he meant by you must accept the continental system. England, in response, will issue the Order in Council. And this is going to say that neutrals might enter the continental ports only if they first stopped in Great Britain. So this means if you're a neutral country that's not allied or on the side of Napoleon, or has taken any allegiance in this fight, you have to stop in Great Britain before you can go to the continent. What this does, this allows British to hopefully get their goods that on these neutral ships and get them to the continent and get past Napoleon's blockade. They want to then in turn strangle France's trade. You remember, if you're if you are a mercantilist, if you're going for bullionism, you don't want a bunch of imports coming into your country. You want to be sending more goods out. And so this is Great Britain's reaction to the Berlin Decree. The regulations will encourage these ships, these neutral ships, to be loaded with British goods before continuing to the continent, and thus seeking to strangle French trade, not French imports of British goods, so to counteract Napoleon's actions. This is where we'll get the Milan Decree of 1807. And this is Napoleon's response to the Order in Council. So they're kind of like bickering children, back and forth. You do this, I do that. You do this, I do that. So we get the Milan Decree, which is Napoleon's response to Great Britain's response. And so any neutral ship entering a British port or submitting to a British warship at sea would then be confiscated if it attempted to enter a continental port. Okay, so this is a huge deal because Napoleon's not saying if you're neutral and you were just stopping in Great Britain to get some of your own goods and we're already planning to come to the continent to trade, you can be confiscated. Your goods can be confiscated. And who does this really bother? This is huge for the Americans. Here we are, this neutral country, and this is going to suck then a neutral country into the problems between Britain and France. This is going to bring America in. And this is going to equal the War of 1812, when the U.S. will eventually declare war against Britain in defense of its neutral shipping rights. The United States is not going to stand for this. They're going to declare war, saying we have the right to trade. We are neutral in this disagreement. The continental system is ultimately going to be one of Napoleon. We're going to get to some of the other greatest failures, because it is going to cause widespread antagonism to Napoleon's rule in Europe. Remember, he's seen more as a conqueror than a liberator. Imports of America were too much in demand in Europe. They had been a staple in Europe. Remember, all of these new goods coming from the New World, and they were too needed and too wanted in Europe for Napoleon to really successfully stop them, and it angered people that they couldn't get these goods. European industries cannot equal Britain's industrial output, and we talked about this with the putting out system, and as we're moving towards the Industrial Revolution, the rest of Europe is just not at that point. They are not ready. They need Britain's industrial output. And without railroads, the continental system was impossible to maintain. They didn't have the transportation to go from place to place within the continent. Shippers, shipbuilders, and dealers in overseas goods and a powerful element of the older bourgeoisie will be ruined by the continental system. So all of this building up that France had done in our new bourgeoisie class and traders and merchants and shipbuilders is going to be ruined. Some of the great things that had happened in France are going to be set back by Napoleon's continental system. And Eastern Europeans will especially be hit hard, as they have, as we've talked about, have no industry and were dependent on these imports from the other nations. British will make up this lost trade that Napoleon has caused them by expanding their exports to Latin America, and so it's not going to do the damage that Napoleon had anticipated. He definitely does not get nearly anywhere close to any positive results compared to the negative results of his continental system. So what happens now is a lot of people are unhappy with Napoleon, and we're going to get what is called the Peninsular War. Okay, and why it's called the Peninsular War is this is a revolt against Napoleon's power occurring in Spain. And Spain is on the Iberian Peninsula, hence the name Peninsular War, and this is going to take place from 1808 to 1814. So Napoleon had not achieved the goal of hurting Great Britain. It delays probably by several years the Industrial Revolution in France and hurts the French economy, and now it's got Spain ready to revolt against Napoleon. The backstory is Napoleon had asked Spain's help in invading Portugal, and they had refused. And when Napoleon then tried to retaliate and tighten his control over Spain by replacing the Spanish king with his brother Joseph, the Spanish people will wage a costly guerrilla war against Napoleon, or a revolt against Napoleon. And they will, of course, by France's natural enemy, be aided by the British under one of their ablest commanders, the Duke of Wellington. And France will suffer from Britain's counter-blockade, resulting in the continental system's failure. So again, we have the failure that take place to the continental system, now a revolt where the British and Spanish are allied together. And so Napoleon's feeling all of this loss. He had been at his height in 1807, and now Napoleon, things are kind of falling apart for him. So he is looking for a scapegoat. Who can I blame for this? Surely it can't be me. And Napoleon is going to turn on Alexander I of Russia, who had actually been his ally and supported his blockade against Britain. Remember, Russia had allied with him in this blockade. And so he's going to looking for a scapegoat, going to turn against Alexander I, which I feel was a really irrational and misplaced accusation. And in we're going to get back to what happens then. As you can figure, if he's going to go against Alexander I, we're going to end up in Russia. But what happens in between this time is Napoleon in 1810 is going to marry Marie Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of the Austrian emperor and niece of Marie Antoinette. And so by marriage now going into this Russian campaign, Napoleon will now be the nephew of Louis XVI, and begin to show more consideration to French noblemen of the old regime, or the ancient regime. And so we definitely see the hearkening of absolutism and the abandonment of the French Revolution ideals at this point. And so that's, kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we move into this now turn against Russia in the Russian campaign of 1812. So Napoleon is going to invade Russia in June of 1812 with his grand army of 600,000, totally against all of his advisors' advice, okay? That sounds redundant, but against all of the people who have been with him and were militarily strong and had, through meritocracy, gotten to the top-ranking officials and advisory positions to advise him against this. Only 1/3 of his forces going into Russia are going to be French. And the cause for this Russian campaign or going into Russia again is just Napoleon is mad. The Russians had withdrew from his continental system due to economic hardships it had caused, and Napoleon now needs a whipping boy or a scapegoat, and he has misplaced anger at Russia, and he is going to go after them. So the Battle of Borodino of 1812 is going to be one of our first battles that we're going to talk about with the Russian campaign, and it is going to end in a draw or a tie with the Russians retreating in good order. And so this is September of 1812. And Napoleon, in this battle, although it ends in a draw, so I mean he's not really at loss, he has gotten himself a long way from France or from even French-controlled land. And he is going to follow them as they retreat, as the Russians retreat in good order. You know, it's a draw. He's going to follow them even further into Russia, even further away from France or French-controlled land, which is going to overextend himself. Napoleon is going to be forced to retreat them from Moscow after 5 weeks during the brutal Russian winter. So he's followed them all the way in. The Russians have been practicing, as they're very good at, a scorched earth policy or tactic where they're burning everything as they retreat. And so Napoleon had planned on having plenty of supplies and pillaging goods as he moved through, and this isn't now a possibility. So he's found himself 5 weeks in during a brutal Russian winter without enough supplies or enough things to keep his troops alive, and he is going to then have to retreat from Moscow. The Russians are going to evacuate, then burn Moscow, and refuse to negotiate, and so Napoleon is not left with a lot of terms at this people. 50 to 70,000 of Napoleon's 600,000 troops will die in one day, and only 30,000 men in Napoleon's army will return from this retreat, return from their tour in Russia or from Moscow out of 600,000. So only 30,000 of 600,000 will return. 400,000 will die of battle casualties, starvation, and exposure. It said that it was so cold in this grand retreat that not only were they lacking the supplies because of the scorched earth, but the horses were so cold that it said that a soldier could take their sword and cut a piece of the horse off, and the horse wouldn't even notice. They were so frozen. I mean, that is how cold and how horrible it was. And then another 100,000 will be taken prisoner at this time. Napoleon, who makes it back with only 30,000 of his troops, will have to race home and raise another army, while Austria and Prussia are going to now desert Napoleon and join Russia and Great Britain in what will be known as the Fourth Coalition. So this is how we make the turn to the Fourth Coalition of 1813 to 1814. Here's another picture of the retreat from Moscow. You can see Napoleon's the only one on the horse, casualties falling everywhere. Pretty famous picture of this retreat. And so now into the War of the Fourth Coalition. Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia are now all allied against France. At the Battle of Leipzig, or what is also known as the Battle of Nations, you will see it called by either name, in October of 1813, Napoleon will finally be defeated. He will be outnumbered 2-1 on the battlefield and lose 500,000 of his 600,000 Grand Army. This is the largest battle in world history until the 20th century. You may want to underline or highlight that. Napoleon, although there is no question that he is defeated and who the victors are. He is going to refuse to accept the terms of the Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich's Frankfurt proposals to reduce France to its historical size in return for his remaining on the throne. So he has an option to stay the ruler of France as long as it is returned to its historical size before his expansionist policies after the French Revolution, and he refuses this proposal. So, the Quadruple Alliance is created in March of 1814, and that is where each power, our Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, agree to provide 150,000 soldiers to enforce these peace terms upon Napoleon. And Napoleon this is pretty much an act to push him out. Napoleon will be abdicated since he will not agree to these terms as emperor on April 4th of 1814 after the Allied armies are able to enter Paris. The Bourbons, as I told you, Louis XVIII is sitting out there, not in the greatest health. He's crippled by gout, too much food, alcohol, very sedentary, royal lifestyle, but he is the brother of Louis XVI, so Louis XVIII will be restored to the throne, and they're now Bourbon monarchy back on the throne. He will give us the Charter of 1814, and this is where King Louis XVIII creates a two-house legislature that represented only the upper classes. This is the first constitution in European history issued by a monarch. Okay, not by a parliament, but by a monarch. So that's very important to note here. This restoration of the Bourbons is going to maintain most of Napoleon's reforms. The ones that had worked, the domestic policies that Napoleon had kept from the French Revolution, are going to be kept by Louis XVIII, such as the Code of Napoleon, the Concordat with the Pope, and the abolition of feudalism. So this is the success of the Revolution. This is the stuff carried by Napoleon from the Revolution, and Louis XVIII is going to keep it. And this is where we're going to get the first Treaty of Paris, and we'll talk about the second Treaty of Paris in class next time. But the first Treaty of Paris is going to happen on May 30th of 1814. And France, in the first Treaty of Paris, is going to have to surrender all territory gained since the wars of the Revolution had begun in 1792. So that Empire period of 1804 to 1814 is now ended with this first Treaty of Paris by the defeat in 1814. Okay, so France is going to have to backgrade all the way back to the Revolutionary Wars of 1792 and surrender all the territory they have gained. The Allied powers will impose no indemnity or reparations. And Louis XVIII refuses to pay is what really happens. But since he is going to be the Bourbon back on the throne, it's restored an absolute monarchy, and he has agreed to limit France to its historical size. The Allies are not going to push against it. I want you to write next to this first Treaty of Paris that the Allies were very friendly in their negotiations with France at this time. We're going to see that play out differently with the second Treaty of Paris. Napoleon, as part of this first Treaty of Paris, will be exiled to the island of Elba as a sovereign with an income from France. Okay, so he has just been abdicated from his throne. He's given an income for his military service, but he is exiled, so that he cannot be in France to try to rally any of support. The Quadruple Alliance then will agree to meet in Vienna to work out a general peace settlement. And this meeting in Vienna is going to be called the Congress of Vienna. And that is where we will pick up in class and come to the end of the French Revolution. And also do our art analysis of Jacques-Louis David's work throughout the French Revolution.